Now we're going to go ahead and learn how to graph the sine functions using the amplitude, the period, and the midline that we've been talking about. So in order to graph, I need to identify those three pieces individually. So what I'm going to do is start out with the amplitude. Now in an equation that looks like this, the amplitude is going to be found by looking at the coefficient of the sine or the cosine function. So in this case, it's going to be a value of 3. Amplitude is always positive, so even if that was a negative 3, we would say our amplitude is 3. The period, we're going to find by looking at our b value, and the b value is next to the x. So we find the period by taking the original period of sine and cosine, which is 2 pi, and dividing that by our b. In this case, our b is 2, so I will say 2 pi divided by 2. But then looking at that, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 times pi just gives me pi. So our new period is pi. So this takes only half the distance that a traditional sine graph would take to complete. And finally, the midline, we find by looking at the constant term that's either being added or subtracted to our sine or cosine function. And in this case, that is a positive 1, so my midline is going to be at 1. So now that we have the amplitude of 3, the period of pi, and a midline of 1, we can go ahead and start graphing this. So I'm going to start with my x and y axis. I'm going to make my x-axis longer than my y-axis because that's the direction that my graph is going to go. And I'm going to start with my midline. So my midline is up at 1, so I'm going to label that as a 1 right there. Now that represents the center of my graph. The amplitude tells me how far up and how far down to go from that center. So since my amplitude is 3, I'm going to come up here and label my highest point a 4. I'm going to go down below and label this as negative 2. Both of those are 3 units away from my center point of 1. Now with sine and cosine, we want to be able to split this up into 4 sections. So on the x-axis, I'm going to label 4 points here, the fourth one being the end of my period. And with this, we said our period was pi, so I'm going to take that pi and label it on the fourth one. Now, these are equally spaced, so I can go ahead and divide that period by 4 to find this first mark, which would end up being pi over 4. And then I can go ahead and take that pi over 4 and multiply it by 2 or 3 to find the second or the third value along here. If I take pi fourths and multiply it by 2, I end up getting pi halves. If I take pi fourths and multiply it by 3, I get 3 pi fourths. And just to check, if I were to multiply it by 4 to get the last one, I'd get 4 pi over 4, which would simplify to give me pi. Now, I know that a sine wave starts at its midline. So I'm going to change colors here. Let's go with this red color. So I'm going to start with a point right here at the midline. And then by the time I get to pi fourths, I should be at my maximum value, which is going to be up top here. And it's not working. By the time I get back to pi halves, I should be back to the midline. 3 pi fourths, I should be down at a minimum of negative 2. And then by pi, I should be back to my midline. And that would represent 1 period of my sine wave here.